Okay.
So Ambassador Smith, can you tell us a little bit what your day-to-day looks like? What is the role of an ambassador? What do you do every day?
Well, there are lots of different pieces to it, but the biggest, most consistent part to the job here as U.S. ambassador is about 5 times a week, all 30 NATO ambassadors sit around a big round table and join what they call a North Atlantic Council meeting. The NAC is what we refer to it here at NATO HQ. And in the NAC, those meetings are about 2 to 3 hours long. And we take on different topics. As you might imagine, we spend a lot of our time these days talking about the war in Ukraine, the first land war in Europe, really since World War II. And NATO is spending an enormous amount of time thinking about how individually NATO allies can provide assistance to Ukraine, but also what the alliance can be doing for Ukraine as well, particularly in the area of non-lethal support. But we also share intelligence in those meetings and have conversations about events on the ground and the changing nature of the war. So about 5 times a week, I have those meetings. And then leading up to those meetings and after those meetings, I often meet in small groups or one-on-one with some of the ambassadors. Sometimes, as you all know, NATO operates by consensus, which means that all 30 of us have to agree all the time. And when we don't, we can't get something done. There's no majority voting. And so in order to get our work done and reach consensus at 30, I spend a lot of time running around and meeting and talking to the allies that maybe disagree. So in the case of Sweden and Finland joining the alliance, all of you know that Turkey raised its hand and said, we have some concerns. And so what we've been doing since then is individually and in small groups, sitting down with the Turks to hear those concerns, working through them, and also meeting with the aspirants, Sweden and Finland, to hear from them about how the three of those 3 countries could work through it. So my days consist of big NAC meetings, individual and small group meetings with perm reps. I also do press, usually a day a week. I reserve an hour or 2 to do some TV and radio to get our message out. I have to meet with my interagency colleagues back in Washington. So I dial in on the screen and I talk to my colleagues at the State Department, the Department of Defense, and the White House to understand how they want me to represent US policies here. And I seek guidance from them on how best to do that. And then lastly, I have outside meetings. Sometimes I meet with the European Union. Sometimes I meet with ambassadors from countries like Jordan or Morocco or Pakistan or Georgia, or sit down with the Ukrainian ambassador and talk to her. So it's a smattering of meetings, NAC, some press work, talking to my interagency colleagues, and that makes for a pretty exciting day, but a pretty long one too.
Can you tell us a little bit about this recent Madrid conference that seems to have been a big pivot point, a lot of changes coming?
Sure. So NATO had a big summit. We usually have summits annually. This was going to be a big one when we decided to do it last summer. When NATO leaders gathered, they decided that in late June of this year, they'd have a big summit in Madrid. And they knew that was going to be a pivotal moment for the alliance at the time, because the alliance had decided to rewrite the strategic concept. The strategic concept is the mission statement for the alliance. It lays out what NATO's purpose is, what its toolkit looks like, what are its core tasks, and how it's going to handle a bunch of future challenges. And this is a document that NATO only rewrites about once every 10 years. The last time NATO rewrote its strategic concept was 12 years ago. So we thought this year's summit was going to be all about this new strategic concept, this new mission statement. And it was, to a certain degree, but there were lots of other moving pieces to it too. And that has to do with the war in Ukraine. And it has to do with Sweden and Finland deciding to join the alliance, which is something I never thought I would really see in my lifetime. I wasn't sure. Sweden and Finland have always wanted to be close partners to NATO, but they've held back from full-fledged membership for many different historical, cultural reasons. And so having them come forward and having NATO announce in Madrid that it was going to start the accession process for these two countries was a really big deal. But other things happened. The other big thing that happened was that the alliance kind of rewrote and redesigned what we call its deterrence and defense posture. And by that, I mean, after Russia went into Ukraine on February 24th, NATO allies moved troops into Eastern Europe to send a signal to Moscow that we didn't want them to cross into NATO territory with the war in Ukraine. But what we did at the summit was to say, above and beyond what we did right after February 24th, what should the medium and long-term posture of the alliance look like? And so NATO made a series of announcements and decisions as it relates to NATO force posture in Madrid as well. And the last thing that happened is, for one of the first times ever, the alliance invited 4 Asia-Pacific countries, South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, and Australia, to join NATO allies at the summit to talk about some of the challenges we all face as it relates to both Russia and China. So it was a big deal. It was a pivotal moment for the alliance, and we got a lot done. And I know President Biden was pleased with the outcome, as were all the leaders. And we were able to project unity and resolve as it relates to Russia and Russian aggression in Ukraine.
Can you tell us a little bit more about this global emphasis of NATO, thinking beyond its immediate neighborhood, bringing Asian allies into the conversation?
Sure. So I think as NATO thinks about its future challenges, things like emerging and disruptive technologies, or cybersecurity, or disinformation, some of what we call hybrid tactics that are used by the Russians, by the Chinese, and other countries around the world, it started to think more creatively about ways in which it could work with other democracies, other like-minded allies, other countries that share our values to deal with some of those challenges. And that brings us to these Asia-Pacific partners. And again, that was one of the reasons that we wanted to have those nations come to the Madrid summit, sit at the table with us, and talk about how together we can tackle some of these challenges. It turns out that the Japanese have experience in dealing with some of these hybrid tactics from the Chinese. And similarly, a small country like Estonia has to deal with some of those hybrid tactics from Russia. And so sharing those lessons, sharing ways in which they're countering some of those tactics, and sharing lessons learned is an important part of what goes on here. But broadly, I'll tell you, in 1990, just to give you a sense of how far the alliance has come, 1990, the alliance had 16 members and 0 partners. Today, we're about to have 32 members of the alliance, and we have 40 partners around the world. So NATO works with countries all over, whether it's Moldova or Georgia, countries in the Middle East, countries in North Africa, in many, many corners around the world, to expand the ways in which it can fortify its global partnerships, work with like-minded allies, share lessons, and even in some cases, train and exercise with those forces. I think you might be on mute. Don't know.
Good call there. If the Madrid conference was a reevaluation of sort of where NATO is today and what the next few years look like, what do you think, wherever it's going to be, that the what do you think the next conference is going to talk about? What are the emerging challenges that aren't quite on the radar yet?
Well, NATO has sketched an agenda out for itself. It's called the NATO 2030 agenda. And that is that it's done some reflecting on what are the types of challenges that the alliance is going to face up to 2030. And so the alliance is, in addition to dealing with the war in Ukraine, is thinking about some of the technological challenges. We have countries around the world that are trying to erode our kind of collective technological edge. We have countries, again, that are relying more on cyber. And so, the NATO alliance, when it was created 73 years ago, was focused very much on conventional military forces. So what NATO traditionally has done is to think about things like troops and tanks and munition, right? So just the nuts and bolts of defense and military policy. But over time, what NATO has evolved in and what we're going to be doing in the future is we're going to be thinking about all those other domains. We're going to be thinking about space as a new domain. Traditionally, NATO would think about land, air, and sea, because that's how you would construct your military forces and assign them to different domains. But the alliance looking forward is thinking about cyber and space as some new domains as well. And then the other thing is, every few years, NATO gets a new Secretary General. That's the person who sits on top of the NATO alliance and kind of runs the whole alliance. We just recently extended the tenure of the current Secretary General. It's a Norwegian by the name of Jens Stoltenberg. We extended it to September of next year. But what we'll have to do at next year's summit is that we will have to select a new NATO Secretary General. And that takes some time because, as you can imagine, all 30 allies have a different perspective on who should be the head of the alliance. And so we'll be debating that in the months to come.
There's some great questions in the chat here. I'm going to pivot to from our students. Number one is a practical question. How did NATO function during COVID, and how does that impact your ability to negotiate?
Well, that is a very good question. I wasn't here at the time I arrived in December of last year, although we were kind of on the back end of COVID and obviously are still grappling with it in many ways. But because NATO allies, so we have NATO headquarters here, and all 30 allies have a mission here at NATO headquarters. They're kind of like an embassy. And most of those missions and most of the work here at NATO headquarters is in a classified setting. The emails that we send are classified. Many of the discussions we have are classified. And because of that, despite the fact that COVID was preventing many people from coming into the office, there was a need for NATO to be operating at a basic level to enable the NATO ambassadors to come together in a mask, sit a certain distance apart, and continue to have those NAC meetings that I talked about in the beginning so that work could continue here inside the NATO alliance. So it was a reduced staff. You had some people that were able to do some unclassified work at home, but for those that had to do classified work, they had to kind of cycle through, not spend 14 hours a day here as one normally would, but to have kind of smaller rotating schedules where ambassadors and the team here working at US NATO could come in and get some of their classified work done. But it was enormously challenging.
Evelyn is asking how the addition of Sweden and Finland changes the game when it comes to Ukraine.
Also a good question. So when Sweden and Finland joined the alliance officially, we're now, just to back up, in the ratification process. where every member of the alliance has to ratify the agreement. We call it the accession protocol for Sweden and Finland to join. And so every parliament, or in our case, Congress, will have to ratify. So we're in that process right now. We've had, I think, about a third of the allies ratify. We're waiting for the US Congress to ratify the accession protocol. Once that's done, once they become full-fledged members, it is going to change the dynamic here in some pretty interesting ways. So just in terms of deterrence on NATO's eastern flank, in terms of protecting those allies that are, the Baltic states, Poland, those that are in northeastern Europe, they're going to find that the addition of Sweden and Finland is going to help them a great deal in terms of added military presence, new opportunities to exercise and train together. We already have a close relationship with Sweden and Finland. They've participated in NATO operations. They've joined us in exercising and training, but having them as full-fledged members, they'll be at the table in the NAC. All 32 of us will be around the table. And those countries in Eastern Europe, particularly Northeastern Europe, are going to feel their presence. And Russia is going to get a very clear signal. It also presents a bit of a dilemma for Russia, because now Russia is going to have this 800-mile border with Finland that it may have to think about in ways that it hasn't had to think about it, given their more neutral status in recent decades. So it will give us two allies that share our values. They bring very capable militaries. They have very strong reserve forces and very strong naval forces as well, in particular. So I think generally the mood here at the alliance is we're excited for these two countries to join. Many of us already have close ties with Sweden and Finland, but it's really going to be a remarkable moment when they become full-fledged members.
We have a question from Mosey here about Ukraine's potential candidacy for the alliance.
So Ukraine and Georgia both have expressed an interest in becoming NATO members. And many moons ago in 2008, at a summit that took place in Bucharest, the allies came together that year and said that it wasn't a question of whether, but it was when. So in essence, in 2008, the alliance said, we're quite certain, we are certain, that Ukraine and Georgia will eventually become members of this alliance. So first and foremost, I would say the alliance has been crystal clear in messaging Russia in this moment that its open door policy, meaning that enlargement remains a very real possibility for these countries, will not be negotiated away. We are not willing to agree to any conditions that Russia puts on the table that insist that NATO should stop enlarging. Instead, the alliance has said very clearly, we will not get rid of our open door. So point number one is the door is open, and Ukraine and Georgia can work towards membership. Now, in order to become a member, though, you have to meet certain criteria. And Ukraine and Georgia have work to do in terms of reforming their government structure. These are countries that were once part of the Soviet Union. They are still transitioning and still tackling with some of the challenges of turning over and turning into a full-fledged functioning democracy. And most importantly, we have to focus on stopping the war in Ukraine. We don't want to have a situation where we're talking about membership, obviously, while there's a full-fledged war that's ongoing inside Ukraine. So point number two is NATO's committed to these two countries, to supporting them. And we want to see them become members, but we've also messaged them that they have some work to do to meet the criteria to become members, but that our door, again, will remain open.
Sort of a bit of a bigger think question for you. How does NATO focuses on security questions as opposed to more social or economic ones. Where do you draw that line? Like, how does the alliance define a security threat?
Well, that's a really good question, because again, back when NATO was created, security was very simple. Security meant military and defense. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we would think about it in terms of tanks and ships and troops. And security was narrowly defined for a very long time during the Cold War. But once the Berlin Wall fell, and once we found ourselves entering kind of the new century, 21st century, after the 9/11 attacks, where we started to grapple with terrorism as a bigger challenge for the transatlantic partners. And now today, as we think about some of those hybrid tactics that I mentioned, economic coercion, political and electoral interference, disinformation, cyber attacks, those types of tactics and those types of tools also fall in a broader definition of security challenges. So while NATO started out thinking primarily about military issues and defending territory from Soviet tanks rolling into NATO territory, now we look at it more holistically. But it raises questions, as you noted, about where you draw the line. And there's an interesting debate here in Brussels because there's another big multilateral institution that many of you know called the European Union. And the European Union is increasingly looking at a broader definition of security. And so Europeans in this organization, to which the United States does not belong, is looking at things like how to counter disinformation, but so is the NATO alliance. And so we also spend a lot of time here thinking about how NATO and the EU can come together to talk about some of these shared challenges. So as we broaden the definition of security, it brings in questions about where do you draw the line. We try to stick to, again, the strategic concept that we just sketched out. That will be our guiding light in many ways, and help us resolve some of those debates. But NATO allies for themselves have to determine what stays in the NATO family and what is better handled somewhere else, maybe at the United Nations, maybe at the European Union, or maybe at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So there are lots of options in terms of where to take on some of those added security challenges, but NATO's trying to carve out which areas address allies' security and what risks they provide going forward.
If you don't mind to follow up on that one, how do y'all navigate some of that overlap? I think disinformation, is the example you just gave, is a great example.
Yeah, I think what it comes down to is trying to find ways, even informally, that EU officials can meet with NATO officials and individual allies that are members of both institutions or that have close relationships with both institutions can come together and talk through, okay, what types of tools are you developing to counter, say, disinformation or cyber attacks? What can we learn from each other? Can we coordinate these efforts in any way? Could we divide and conquer? Can we perhaps agree that this particular aspect of disinformation or cybersecurity belongs inside the EU? Should we have some bits stay inside NATO channels? As you would imagine, there's some duplication, and to a certain degree that's unavoidable, but you just want to make sure that you're minimizing that duplication by doing as much coordinating as possible. So that's kind of the challenge there.
Then another great question in the chat here about NATO leadership and how the hierarchy works. How did Jens Stoltenberg ascend to leadership, and who's next?
We don't know who's coming next. That's going to be the debate that allies will have. In essence, what we will do is countries will come together in small groups without Jens Stoltenberg. We'll meet just the 30 allies in a room and start talking through some of the candidates that we believe would be ideal. And different countries will bring different names forward. They're often former heads of state. In some cases, they could be a former foreign minister, former defense minister, and we'll start debating the pros and cons. First and foremost, we have to think about what we're looking for in a particular leader, what we believe would be best in this moment, what type of skill sets, what type of experience. There's a debate here. NATO has never had a female Secretary General. And so there is a question about the degree to which we want to put added emphasis on diversity and look at a bigger pool of female candidates. So that will be part of the debate as well. But we will keep working on this and debating it until we get it down to consensus. Ultimately, the allies will have to agree at 30 on a single individual, and that's how it will be decided at the end of the day. In terms of how the hierarchy works, I mean, the NAC meetings that I mentioned at 30 are chaired by the Secretary General. So he's running the meeting and offering up opening remarks and then welcomes comments from allies. But in essence, this alliance, while we rely on Jens Stoltenberg for his leadership, the big decisions are taken by all 30 allies. The 30 allies at NATO drive the policy forward through consensus with his help. And he has his own staff. It's called the international staff here at NATO, but it is the allies that shape and design policy.
Was that you just throwing your hat in the ring for next cycle? First female Secretary General?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
We have a great question from Novice Lab number 5 about how many languages you speak.
I speak 3 languages, English, French, and German. And maybe one more question, then I'm sorry, I've gotta run.
Well, we do have so many questions here, and we will make sure to take a peek at them all and try to answer them in-house. We certainly appreciate your time here. I think this is a good one from Noah. What role does NATO have influencing the actions of private actors, potentially in the realm of sanctions, or you know, sort of especially as power becomes increasingly decentralized from the state?
Well, it is a good question about how NATO is grappling with non-state actors. And that is a new challenge that definitely defines the security environment that we find ourselves in today. We are not living in a world where the conflicts that erupt or crises that emerge are always rooted in interstate or intrastate conflict, that it's not necessarily country A fighting country B. We find now that there are groups within states. There are terrorist groups in some cases. There are super empowered individuals that can disrupt our societies and pose a security challenge. There are all different types of actors that we find ourselves grappling with. And this has been a major adjustment for the NATO alliance over many years. I think the turning point for the alliance was really after the 9/11 attacks, when the alliance for the first time invoked its famous Article 5 clause of the founding treaty, the Washington Treaty, which is an attack on one is an attack on all. And it was after those attacks on September 11th that NATO allies said, we will come to the assistance of the United States. And collectively, NATO allies went into Afghanistan. And that was a very different set of circumstances because first and foremost, the allies were operating in a space in quite a bit of distance from NATO territory. You know, traditionally, the alliance was focused on protecting NATO territory from the Soviet threat. And then here it was after 9/11 going into an expeditionary operation in a faraway place like Afghanistan. So that was a major shift for the alliance in more ways than one. But the broader question about sanctions, I mean, NATO does not get into the sanctions toolkit. We don't have the power to impose sanctions, and we're not responsible for that. That is in many ways something that's handled by the European Union, working closely with the United States and other allies, such as the United Kingdom now, that are not members of the European Union. So again, we're focused on security, but we are broadening it to a wider set of issues than just state-on-state conflict.
Well, folks, can we come off mute, give our NATO ambassador a big round of applause. Thank you. We are so appreciative.
Well, listen, if I can just say something at the very end here. You guys, by doing this, by focusing on debate, you're giving yourselves the absolute best tools in the entire world, because irrespective of what you do, you could do anything in your future. You could be a painter, you could be a dentist, you could be an engineer, a doctor, a lawyer, anything, you name it, whatever you do, debate is going to help you, because it helps you organize your thoughts. It helps you professionally deliver your points and get your message across. Maybe you're going to be a diplomat and you're going to need it to debate another country on an area that you disagree. So congratulations to all of you for taking advantage of this incredible program that I firmly believe in. Keep up debating, keep up your enthusiasm and passion for debate, and just enjoy everything that you will get out of it. And I guarantee you that in 20 years, you're going to look back and say, I'm so glad I spent some time working on my debate skills, because it will pay dividends. So thank you. Thanks for the invitation today, and enjoy your summer, and good luck debating. NATO.
We couldn't have asked for a better call to arms and have folks continue to debate during the season. And we hope we can catch you at some point when you come back to the States.
All the best. Take care. Happy Monday.